Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I never paid much attention to my neighbor before. He was just another face in the building, another door I passed by on my way to the elevator, just another name on the mailbox. But then something started to bother me. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a small detail that seemed too strange to ignore after a while. It was the light. The light in his apartment. It was always on. I couldn't remember a time when the apartment was dark. At night, when I would get home from work, the soft glow of a lamp would filter through the blinds. In the morning, when I left for work, the light would still be on, as if he never went to sleep. Even during the afternoon, on weekends, the same faint light would shine through. It became something I noticed without meaning to. I would catch myself looking at it when I came home, wondering why I hadn't heard him come and go. People are creatures of routine, and every day I saw his apartment lit up, it made me feel like something was off. He never opened the door. No sounds of movement. No sounds of life at all, except for the light. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was just a night owl, or perhaps a person who worked strange hours. But then the oddest thing happened one night. I had come home late, just after midnight. I dropped my keys on the table, and there it was, the light. Still on, casting a faint orange glow through the window. The apartment across from mine was dark, as usual, but it felt different somehow. I glanced over at the light, just as I had hundreds of times before. But this time, something was different. I saw movement. It wasn't much, but enough to catch my attention. A shadow. A shape stretching across the wall of his living room, moving slowly. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Was it him? The neighbor? Had I finally seen him after all this time? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe the shadow of a tree outside swaying in the wind. But as I watched, the shape shifted, sliding across the wall in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind. The shape was moving, deliberate, almost as if it was reaching for something or someone. My skin crawled. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but something kept me glued to the window, my eyes locked on the shifting shadow. It inched toward the door, my door. I blinked. Was I seeing things? My head swam, my vision blurred for a second. And when I focused again, the shadow was closer. It had stopped moving, now hovering right near the edge of the doorframe. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know if it was the darkness playing tricks on me or if something far worse was about to happen. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? Should I call the police? But why? There was nothing wrong, yet. Then I heard it. A faint creak. The sound of wood bending, shifting, as if someone or something was standing just beyond my door. My breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. But then, I thought I heard something else. A faint shuffle. A slow, steady dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was coming from his apartment. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen by the door, listening to the faint noises. The shuffling sound was so soft, almost imperceptible, but it made my heart race. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, straining to hear. For a moment, all I could hear was the dull hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen and the rhythmic beat of my own pulse in my ears. The apartment felt strangely quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned around slowly, glancing at the light from my neighbor's window, still glowing through the blinds. The shadow was gone. Had it moved? Was it still there? I couldn't tell, but the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my reach, was stronger than ever. I should have ignored it. I should have convinced myself that it was nothing, just a trick of my tired mind. But I couldn't. Something in the air had changed. The familiar apartment, once so ordinary, now felt suffocating, as if it were closing in on me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But it wouldn't go away. I knew it was ridiculous. It was late. I was probably just overtired. I hadn't slept well the night before, and the long hours at work had left me exhausted. But still, that dragging sound, the movement, the shadow, it wasn't normal. I forced myself to step back from the door. I didn't want to stay here, staring at the hallway in the dark, wondering what was real and what was just my imagination. But at the same time, I couldn't leave. My feet felt as though they were stuck to the floor. A strange compulsion kept me rooted to the spot. I glanced at my phone, 2 a.m. A long stretch of silence had settled over the building. No cars on the street, no footsteps in the hall. Just the soft buzz of my refrigerator and the distant hum of the city outside. I had to know what was happening next door. I couldn't just ignore it. I had to see for myself, even if it meant risking whatever this strange feeling was. The fear gnawed at me, but curiosity pushed me forward. I quietly crept to the door. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and I winced, hoping that the sound wouldn't carry to the apartment next door. I held my breath as I reached for the door handle. But just before I turned it, I stopped. I swear, for a second, I heard something. A soft whisper, like someone speaking in a language I didn't understand. It was muffled, distant, but it felt close, too close. My hand froze on the doorknob. Was it coming from my neighbor's apartment? I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was probably just the wind or the pipes, making strange noises. Maybe it was the building settling, the walls groaning as they shifted. But the whisper wouldn't leave me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With one last glance at the light in the neighboring apartment, I cracked the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. It felt oddly peaceful for a moment, as though the noise I heard was just a figment of my imagination. But as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to his apartment was slightly ajar. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to my neighbor's apartment, which had always been closed, was now slightly ajar. The narrow gap between the door and the frame seemed to invite me in, like an opening to a place I had no business being. I told myself to turn around, to go back inside my apartment and lock the door behind me. But my feet wouldn't move. A cold, creeping fear crawled up my spine. It wasn't just the door being open that unsettled me, it was the silence. The apartment was still, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. I couldn't hear the usual hum of a TV or the low murmur of a conversation. just the soft breathing of the building around me and the rhythmic thump of my own heartbeat. I glanced back at my apartment. The dim glow in my hallway light barely pushed the darkness back, and my door was still securely shut. But the open door across the hall felt like a breach of some kind of unspoken rule. Why was it open? The question lingered in my mind, but I couldn't answer it. I couldn't make sense of any of it. There was no logical explanation for what was happening, and that only made the situation worse. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I inched forward. Each step felt like a betrayal, as if I were crossing into a space I wasn't supposed to. The hallway stretched out before me, its shadows now far darker than they should have been, as if they were swallowing the light from the street outside. I kept my gaze fixed on the door, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I had to know. I reached the door. It was barely open, the gap just wide enough to peek inside. A faint orange light leaked out, the same glow I had seen from across the hall for so long. It flickered, like a candle struggling against the wind. The light seemed to stretch, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. I hesitated, then pushed the door open slightly. The moment it creaked, a chill ran through me, a sharp, cold sensation that settled in my stomach. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of something I couldn't quite place. And then I saw it. A shape, a figure, standing in the middle of the room. At first, it looked like nothing more than a silhouette, just a shadow against the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person. A man, tall and thin, wearing a long, dark coat. He stood perfectly still, facing the wall, as if he were waiting for something. His back was turned to me, but the way he stood, so rigid and unnatural, sent a wave of panic through my chest. He didn't move, he didn't even seem to breathe. I should have turned and run. I should have called the police, shouted, done anything to break the silence. But I couldn't look away. My feet were frozen to the floor, my mind racing for a reason, for an explanation. But there was none. I didn't notice the door creaking open wider until it was almost fully ajar. My body screamed at me to back away, but my hands reached out, pushing the door a little more. And then I saw the other thing. On the floor, just inside the door, there was a pile of clothes. A dark pile, soaked through with something that looked like dark, dried stains. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, barely catching myself against the hallway wall. Had he? I didn't have time to finish the thought before I heard it. A low, guttural sound. A whisper, or maybe a growl. It came from the man, or whatever he was. His head jerked slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought he had heard me. The door slammed shut. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly falling over. My breath was shallow, my palms sweaty. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I had just seen. Had he seen me? No, he hadn't. But it didn't matter. The feeling was unmistakable. I was no longer alone. Whatever that thing in there was, it knew I was here. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning, my legs shaking. I had to get out of there. I had to go back to my apartment. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made me freeze once again. The light in his apartment, the one I had been watching for days, was flickering off. It was dark now. My breath caught in my throat. The light, that constant presence in the window, the thing that had haunted me for days, was suddenly gone. The room that had been bathed in its soft glow was now swallowed by darkness. I couldn't make sense of it. For as long as I had lived here, that light had never gone out. It had become a symbol of something unsettling, something I couldn't explain. But now, it was dark. I stood frozen in the hallway, just a few steps away from the door to the apartment. My heart was hammering in my chest, my thoughts in disarray. I should have gone back to my place, locked the door, called someone, anyone. But my body refused to obey. I didn't even realize I was moving until I was back in front of his door. The hallway was deathly quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. The sounds of the city outside seemed miles away, muffled and distant. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. I didn't hear anything. No shuffling, no whispers, no dragging sounds. Just silence. A silence so profound it felt suffocating. My hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking. I wanted to know what was inside. The fear, the uncertainty, it was like a compulsion. What if he was gone? What if everything I had seen was just my mind playing tricks on me? But then I thought about the figure inside, the way it had stood motionless, as if waiting. That wasn't normal. None of this was. Without thinking, I turned the knob. The door creaked open, just a crack, and I peered inside. The room was dark now, completely dark. The faint orange glow was gone, replaced by a pitch-black emptiness that seemed to stretch out forever. I stepped inside, the floor beneath me cold and unforgiving. The air was thick with the smell of something metallic, almost sour. My foot brushed against the pile of clothes I had seen earlier, and I recoiled. My stomach twisted. What was it? I had to look. I needed to understand what had happened. I pulled out my phone, it screamed bright in the dark, the light weak and flickering. I shone it toward the pile. There it was, clothes, but something else, something worse. Something dark and sticky clung to the fabric, soaking into it like blood. My hands shook as I snapped the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the horrible mess. Then I heard it again, the sound. That soft, whispering growl. This time, it wasn't coming from the other side of the room. It was right behind me. I spun around so quickly I almost lost my balance. The figure, the man, was standing there, just a few feet away from me. His eyes were wide open, but they were hollow, empty. There was no life in them. His face was pale, sickly, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He didn't move, but his presence filled the room, pressing on me like a physical weight. I gasped, stepping back, my heart racing. The air around me felt cold, freezing. It was as if I were standing in a room that shouldn't exist, like I was trespassing in some otherworldly space. The man didn't speak. He didn't make any sound. He just stood there, staring, as if he were waiting for something to happen. I felt trapped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in, the shadows thickening around me. Every inch of the apartment felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be here, like it had shifted into a place it didn't belong. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. But it wasn't the same soft glow that had been there before. No, this time the light was harsh, blinding, flashing erratically like a strobe. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. It was as if the world had been swallowed by the light. But when the flickering stopped, I was no longer standing in the same room. I didn't know where I was. The apartment had changed. It was bigger now, the walls stretching unnaturally, the shadows deeper. The space felt endless, an infinite corridor that twisted and turned, leading nowhere. The floor beneath me seemed to shift with each step I took, like the whole place was alive. I turned around, looking for the door, but there was no door. No windows. Just darkness creeping in from the edges of the room, folding in on itself like a living thing. And then I heard it. A voice. It was the whisper again, but this time it was clear. It was coming from everywhere. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was low, raspy, as though it was coming from deep within the walls. And it wasn't the man who had spoken. It was something else. Something worse. The words hung in the air, thick with menace, echoing in the hollow emptiness of the room. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling around me like a dark cloud, suffocating and suffused with malice. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I tried to make sense of the nightmare I was in. The man, the figure who had been standing motionless just moments ago, was gone. But the presence was still there, looming, oppressive, like something invisible pressing down on me. The light flickered again, casting the room in brief flashes of blinding brightness. Each flash seemed to distort the space, warping the walls, bending the very air around me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, as though the very air had thickened into something unbreathable. My legs buckled, and I sank to the floor, my hands gripping the edges of the cold wooden floorboards as if they were the only thing anchoring me to reality. The darkness was creeping in, thick and palpable, pulling at me, surrounding me. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of it so loud in my ears it almost drowned out the whispering voice. You shouldn't have come here. I tried to stand, tried to break free from the suffocating grip of whatever force held me in this distorted place, but my body felt heavy, as if it no longer belonged to me. The floor beneath me seemed to sway, warping with every movement, as though the entire apartment was alive and shifting. I reached out, my hand trembling, searching for something, anything, that might help me escape. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the darkness suddenly parted. A door appeared, a faint outline in the shadows, its wood warped and old. It wasn't like the door to the neighbor's apartment, though. This door, this one felt wrong. It was a door that didn't belong. It wasn't supposed to be here. But I didn't have a choice. It was the only way out. I forced myself to stand, using the doorframe to steady myself. My legs were weak, my mind racing with terror, but the door was my only escape. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from the voice, from the oppressive darkness, from whatever nightmare had come to life in this apartment. The door creaked open as I pushed against it, the sound low and groaning, like it had been sealed for centuries. As the door swung wide, the room beyond was revealed. It wasn't a room at all. It was a hallway. A long, endless corridor that stretched far beyond what I could see, vanishing into an inky black void. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, their surfaces coated in dust, and the reflections, when I looked at them, seemed to shift, bending in unnatural ways. Figures moved within the glass, blurry shapes that flickered and vanished before I could focus on them. A chill ran down my spine. The air was colder here, and the smell, something foul, metallic, like blood, filled my nose. I stepped forward, my feet unsteady. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, making it impossible to ignore them. But there was something else now. A soft sound, a rhythm. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every step I took. A tapping. It was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but the door I had just opened was gone. The hallway stretched on infinitely, as though it had swallowed it whole. And still, the tapping continued, growing louder. Closer. It wasn't the man. It wasn't the voice. It was something else. Something worse. The tapping stopped, and the air grew still. I froze, waiting. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. But then the silence was broken by a voice, the same one I had heard before. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was clearer now, louder, as though it was standing right next to me, whispering directly into my ear. My skin crawled. I took a step backward, my breath shallow, my mind racing. There was no escape. There was no way out. And then, from the darkness ahead of me, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, bathed in the dim glow of flickering lights. It was tall, its silhouette stretching impossibly long. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes, cold, unblinking, staring at me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted. I tried to run, to turn and flee, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in a nightmare. The figure started moving toward me, its steps slow but deliberate. Each footfall echoed through the endless corridor, the sound reverberating in my bones. The light flickered again, and when it came back on, the figure was closer. And then I saw it clearly. Its face was gaunt, its eyes hollow, and its skin stretched tight over its skull. Its mouth was open in a grotesque smile, rows of sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light. I finally screamed. The sound tore from my throat, but it was swallowed by the darkness. It was too late. The figure reached out, and everything went black. Have you ever seen something that made you question everything you knew? Something so impossible, yet so real, that it seemed to erase the line between reality and nightmare? I remember the night it happened like it was yesterday. It was late, much later than I usually stayed out. The streets were empty, the kind of quiet that only comes with the early hours of the morning. The city felt different then, still, almost too still. No honking horns, no distant chatter, just the echo of my footsteps as I walked home. I was used to this quiet. It wasn't unusual for the streets to be empty, especially at this hour. The city seemed to sleep, and the only thing that kept me company was the occasional car passing by. But that night, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. It started with a car. At first, I thought it was just another late-night driver heading home, but as it came closer, I realized something was off. The car was moving on its own. No one was behind the wheel. My heart skipped a beat as I stood frozen on the sidewalk. The car glided past me, its headlights casting long shadows across the street. It wasn't speeding or weaving erratically, it was driving, as if there was a driver inside. But there was no one. I don't know what compelled me to follow it, but I did. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just that nagging feeling that something wasn't right, and I needed to understand why. I stayed a few steps behind, watching the car as it slowly made its way down the street. It moved so smoothly, so quietly, that I could hardly believe my eyes. The tires didn't make the usual sounds you'd expect. No hum against the pavement, no faint screech of rubber, just silence. The car turned onto a side street, and without thinking, I followed. The street was darker here, the streetlights spaced farther apart. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, as if they were swallowing up the light. I kept my distance, but I couldn't help but notice how strange it felt to walk beside a car that moved without a driver. I could hear the soft clicking of the car's engine, but it wasn't the usual sound of an idling vehicle. This was something else, more mechanical, almost unnatural. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself wishing I had stayed home, where everything made sense. The car slowed as it approached an old, abandoned building. The kind of place you avoid at night, the windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. The car pulled up to the curb and stopped. For a moment, I stood there, my mind racing, my legs frozen in place. What was I supposed to do now? Should I turn back? Should I call someone? I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as if it were pressing in from all sides. The silence grew louder, deafening. My hand moved to my pocket, and I pulled out my phone, the small light of the screen glowing dimly in the dark. I tried to take a photo, to prove to myself that what I was seeing was real, but my hands were shaking so badly that the picture came out blurry. I looked back at the car, expecting it to start moving again, but it remained still, parked by the curb. The headlights flickered once, and then the car was completely dark. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for all of this. Maybe the car had broken down. Maybe it was some sort of prank. But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary situation. Then, just as I was about to turn and walk away, the car door opened. By itself. I stopped dead in my tracks. The door swung open slowly, with a creak that sent chills down my spine. There was no one inside. The seat was empty. Yet the door was open, as if someone had invited me to step inside. For a brief moment, I thought about walking away. Running back to the safety of the well-lit streets, back to the world where things made sense. But something inside me told me to stay. To look closer. I took a cautious step toward the car, my mind racing. My breathing shallow. The door was wide open now, the interior as dark as the night around it. I could see the faint outlines of the seats, but nothing else. No movement, no sound. Just the eerie stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the car. It felt oddly warm, like the car had been waiting for me. The air inside was thick, but not with the usual smell of leather and fabric. It smelled strange, almost like something metallic, like iron. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing. What was happening? Why was this car here? Why was it waiting for me? The wind picked up, a sudden gust that sent a shiver down my spine. The door slammed shut. And then, the car moved again. Not slowly like before. It sped off down the street, leaving me standing there, staring after it in disbelief. I should have gone home, locked the door, and forgotten about it. But as I turned to walk away, I felt that same unsettling feeling. That something was watching me. That something wasn't quite right. The car was gone. But the question remained, what was it? And why did it find me? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The car had vanished into the dark street, but the strange sense of being watched lingered, crawling up my spine like a cold hand. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see headlights cutting through the shadows, the car returning to claim me, or worse, to lead me into something darker than I could imagine. The city was still eerily quiet. The streets that had once felt comforting, familiar, now seemed ominous, empty, like a stage set for something I wasn't meant to witness. The streetlights buzzed faintly above me, casting pools of dim light, but I could hear nothing except the echo of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The calm felt like a lie, masking something far more dangerous lurking just beyond my sight. I tried to push the incident out of my mind as I walked home, but each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was resisting me. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, as if the world around me was bending, warping. I quickened my pace, feeling a growing need to reach the safety of my apartment, to lock the door behind me and pretend that nothing had happened. But just as I was about to turn the corner to my street, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere, yet filled the space around me. It was a rhythmic sound, steady and mechanical, like the whir of an engine, but it didn't belong here. The air felt thick again, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze. The hum grew louder, more insistent. It was close now. Too close. I turned my head, scanning the street for any sign of the car. There, in the distance, I saw the faint outline of headlights cutting through the darkness. It was the same car. The driverless car. It wasn't moving like it had before. This time, it was speeding toward me, its headlights glaring like a pair of unblinking eyes. I couldn't breathe. My feet felt glued to the sidewalk, unwilling to move, as if my body had lost control. The car slowed as it reached me, coming to a stop just a few feet away. The door creaked open again, just as it had before, inviting me in. I stared at the car, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't be real. Cars didn't drive themselves. Not like this. Not without explanation. There was no reason for it, no technology advanced enough to make this possible. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. And yet, there it was. The door stood open, waiting for me. I felt a strange pull, an invisible force urging me toward it. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of the trance. This is insane, I told myself. You need to get away. But my legs moved before I could stop them. Step by step, I walked toward the car, my body betraying me. As I reached the door, I hesitated. The interior was dark, the seats empty, but there was something about the car that felt alive. Something in the way it waited for me, expectant. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had no choice. I had to see it through. I had to know what this was. I slipped into the car, the leather seats cold beneath me. The door shut softly behind me, sealing me in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as the car started moving again, slowly, almost as if it were testing me. The interior of the car was surprisingly clean, almost pristine, with no sign of wear or age. The dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a soft glow on the otherwise dark space. But there was something unsettling about the stillness. There were no sounds, no engine hum, no air conditioning whirring. Just silence. The car made a turn, and I realized with a shock that I didn't know where it was taking me. I had no memory of the streets we were driving through, no recognition of the buildings passing by. They were all wrong, familiar yet foreign, twisted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move. A shadow, fleeting, but there. My eyes snapped back to the road ahead, my heart racing. I could feel my palms begin to sweat, my breath shallow. Something was watching me. Something was in the car with me. The car turned again, this time down an even darker street, and I could see the faint glow of an old building in the distance. It looked abandoned, like the kind of place people avoided at night. but there was something about it that seemed to pull me in. My hands gripped the seat, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. The car stopped in front of the building, the headlights illuminating the cracked and broken facade. The door opened once more, and I felt a chill sweep over me. The air was thick with something old. Something I couldn't quite place, but it felt ancient. Dangerous. The urge to leave was overwhelming. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out, to run, to escape before it was too late. But I couldn't move. My body refused to listen. And then, from the shadows of the building, I saw something. A figure. It was tall, too tall, its outline distorted and unnatural. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, as if it were not entirely human. I froze. The figure was coming closer, closer to the car. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and no sound came. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped inside the car. The figure reached out a hand. And then, in an instant, everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding in my chest. The sudden rush of panic left me gasping for air as I sat up in the car. My mind was a blur, trying to piece together what had happened. The dark figure. The abandoned building. The hand reaching out. I was still in the car. But this time, something was different. The seatbelt was tied around my chest, holding me firmly in place, as if it had clicked into position of its own accord. My head throbbed, and the world outside the car was wrong. The street had changed. The familiar cityscape I knew so well was gone, replaced by something strange, something unfamiliar. The buildings around me were warped, stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, heavy with a strange, unnatural mist that seemed to cling to everything. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if it were pushing in on me from all sides. I turned to look at the dashboard. The car was still running, though there was no sound of the engine, no hum, no vibration. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance across the walls of the car. My fingers shook as I reached for the door handle. I couldn't stay in here any longer. The car had brought me somewhere, but I had no idea where. I needed to get out. The moment my hand touched the handle, the car jerked forward, as if responding to my intent. The door slammed shut, locking itself with a cold finality. Panic surged through me as I tried again, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The car was in control now. I was trapped. The figure. That tall, unnatural shadow. Where had it gone? Why hadn't I run? The fear was crawling under my skin, tightening like a vice. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was happening here. But the car didn't stop. It kept moving forward, weaving through the distorted streets, past buildings that looked like they were straight out of a nightmare. They weren't buildings at all, more like twisted reflections, like the city itself was trapped in some kind of warped mirror. I could barely make out the shapes as they passed, the windows dark and empty, their forms bending and folding as if the entire world was being reshaped around me. I turned to look behind me. The rearview mirror was dark, but in the reflection, I thought I saw something moving. A shadow. It was fleeting, disappearing as soon as my eyes focused on it. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The car turned down another street, this one even more distorted than the last. The buildings on either side seemed to stretch taller, their windows reflecting nothing but darkness. The streetlights flickered and buzzed as if they were struggling to stay alive. Then, The hum came again, the low, mechanical sound that filled the car. It was coming from the dashboard now, louder and more insistent. The car was responding to something. I couldn't tell what. But it was like it was listening, waiting for something or someone. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. I was thrown forward against the seatbelt, gasping as I struggled to regain my bearings. The door opened again. This time, I didn't hesitate. My heart was racing, my body shaking, but I didn't care. I knew that I couldn't stay in the car any longer. The moment I stepped outside, the car would be behind me, but at least I would have a chance. At least I could escape whatever this place was, whatever was controlling the car. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open with ease, but as I stepped out onto the street, I froze. The world was even more distorted now. The ground beneath me wasn't solid, but a strange, fluid surface that rippled like water with each step I took. The air was thick with an unsettling pressure, pressing down on my chest. I could feel it, the presence, watching me again. From somewhere in the fog, something was waiting for me to make a move. The shadows were moving, alive with a dark energy that seemed to stretch and warp as if they were breathing, shifting. And then I heard the voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You shouldn't have come. The voice made my blood run cold. It wasn't human. It didn't belong here. I looked around, frantic, but I couldn't see where the voice came from. There was nothing but the endless, twisted streets, the warped buildings, and the suffocating mist. I wasn't in the city anymore. I didn't know where I was. The car's engine revved in the distance, breaking the silence. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the fog. I turned toward the car, and in that moment, I saw it. The figure. The one from before. It was standing in front of the car, blocking my path. The same tall, distorted shape, its features still hidden in the mist. It didn't move, but it was there, watching me. The car stopped again, just a few feet away. The door swung open once more, inviting me back inside. It's waiting for you. I didn't know what it wanted, what this place was, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, or I'd be trapped forever. But the car wasn't giving me a choice. It was controlling me, leading me back to it. I felt the pull again, that strange compulsion to get inside. My hands trembled as I stepped forward. Each movement felt like it wasn't mine, like the car was pulling me, pushing me forward against my will. I didn't want to go back, but I felt powerless to stop it. I reached the door. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, closer now, its tall form blotting out the lights from the car. It raised a hand, and I felt something cold brush against my skin. Stay. The voice was louder now, more distinct. And as I reached out for the door, I felt something else. Something darker. Something pulling at my soul. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the sound of the door slamming shut. When I opened my eyes again, the darkness felt different. It was deeper, colder. The faint hum of the car's engine had returned, but it was distant now, almost muffled, as if the car were moving through a tunnel. My head was spinning, and a sharp pain throbbed at my temples, like my mind was trying to piece itself together after being torn apart. I was back inside the car. But nothing looked the same. The seats were no longer the pristine, cold leather I remembered. They were cracked, old, stained with something dark and sticky. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, casting strange, jagged shadows across the cabin. The car was moving, but I couldn't tell where it was going. There was no sound outside the windows, no streets, no familiar cityscape. Just blackness. I could feel the pressure again, the weight of the air pressing in on me, suffocating. My chest tightened as I realized that the car wasn't driving through streets anymore. It was driving through something else, something that wasn't real. The world outside was gone. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It felt like I was trapped inside a nightmare, unable to wake up. My thoughts were disjointed, fractured. What is this place? What's happening to me? I turned toward the door, but there was no handle this time. The window was dark, reflecting nothing but my own terrified face. I raised my hand to the glass, pressing it against the cold surface, but my reflection seemed wrong. My face, my features, they were there, but they were shifting, distorting as if they were made of liquid. I jerked my hand away, feeling the sudden urge to throw up. Stay calm, I told myself. Stay calm and think. But my mind kept spiraling. There was no escaping the pull of the car, no escaping the darkness that surrounded me. I could feel it now, creeping in, the knowledge that I wasn't just trapped in this car. I was trapped in this world. This place. Suddenly, the car jerked, swerving violently to the side. The seatbelt tightened, cutting into my skin as the vehicle shot forward with terrifying speed. My body was pressed back into the seat, and I gritted my teeth against the force, holding on to anything I could to keep from being thrown around. I could hear the wheels screeching, but it wasn't the sound of rubber against asphalt. It was more like metal scraping against metal, like the car was tearing through something that didn't belong. What is this place? The thought echoed in my mind, louder than anything else. The car slowed. It wasn't stopping, but it was moving more cautiously now, as if it were navigating something. I didn't know what to expect next, but my instincts told me that whatever was coming, I wasn't ready for it. And then I heard it again, the voice. The whisper, soft but unmistakable, like a breath on the back of my neck. You shouldn't be here. It was close. Too close. I turned sharply, panic seizing my chest. There, standing in the doorway of the car, was the figure. The tall, distorted shape, its form twisting and stretching in unnatural ways, like it wasn't fully part of the world. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its presence, cold and heavy. It didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. But I didn't need to see its face to know it was watching me, studying me. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, my thoughts in a frenzy, trying to figure out what it wanted, what I was supposed to do. Get out of here. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen at my sides, my legs trembling with the effort of trying to get up, but nothing happened. I was paralyzed. And then, in the silence, I heard the car's door open behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. The door was open again. The figure stepped forward, its long, crooked limbs moving closer. There was no sound as it approached, no footsteps. It simply was. The voice came again, closer now. Come closer. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My chest felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight, and my throat was dry. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out for the door. The figure was still moving toward me, its form bending, distorting as if it were made of smoke, its limbs stretching impossibly long. "It's waiting for you." The voice was everywhere now, in my ears, in my head. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I reached for the door, my fingers grazing the handle. It was cold. I felt a jolt of energy pass through me as I touched it, like the door itself was alive, pulsing with some unseen force. The figure was right behind me now, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its coldness, the chill of something ancient, something wrong, pressing down on me. I turned the handle, and the door slammed shut again, trapping me inside. I gasped, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The figure had vanished, but I could still feel it, its presence lingering in the air. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing, no escape, no way out. The darkness was everywhere. And then, slowly, the car started moving again, its engine humming faintly, as if nothing had happened. But it had. Everything had changed. This wasn't a world I knew. This wasn't my city. I didn't know where I was, or what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer in control. The car moved forward, but it didn't feel like it was traveling on a road anymore. It was gliding, almost weightless, as if it were suspended between worlds. The view outside the window was still blackness, endless and consuming. The shapes I had seen before, the strange, warped buildings and distorted streets, had vanished, leaving only the deep, all-encompassing void. It was like the car was driving through a space that didn't exist, a place that had no rules, no structure. A place outside of time. I leaned against the seat, trying to steady my breath, trying to focus on something, anything. But there was nothing to grasp onto. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of dashboard lights. The voice, the whispers that had haunted me, were gone. But the feeling remained. The presence was still here, somewhere, watching. I had no idea how long I'd been trapped in this nightmare, but I knew it wasn't over. There was no end in sight. The car was still moving, still carrying me through this empty space, but it wasn't leading me anywhere. It was just moving. And I was still powerless, still trapped inside, with no way to stop it. A sharp chill ran down my spine as I looked out the window again. The darkness beyond had started to shift. It wasn't as solid as before. It rippled, like a pool of ink spreading across the surface of the world. The edges of the void bent and twisted, as if something unseen was pulling at the fabric of reality itself. I could see faint outlines now, shapes that didn't make sense, shadows that stretched and curled like fingers reaching out for me. The car slowed, but it didn't stop. It glided through this twisting, changing world as if it had a destination in mind. But I couldn't see it. There was nothing ahead. Just more blackness, more shifting shapes. Suddenly, the sound of the engine cut out. The car was still moving, but there was no hum, no vibration. It was like everything had gone silent. The air in the car felt thicker now, heavier. It pressed against me, suffocating me. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague shape in the darkness. But as the car drew closer, it became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body distorted in ways that defied logic. Its limbs stretched out unnaturally long, its head tilting at an odd angle. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. The car didn't slow down. It was heading straight for the figure. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything to stop it, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this car, being pulled toward this thing. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath in the air. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. The car kept moving, and I knew it was going to hit it. I braced myself, my heart pounding in my chest, but the impact never came. The car passed through the figure, as if it wasn't even there, as if it was nothing more than smoke or shadow. I blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone, dissolved into the void. But the car didn't stop. It kept moving forward, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just passed through something wrong. I turned to look out the window again, but this time the darkness had changed. It wasn't just black anymore. There were streaks of light, faint glimmers that shimmered and twisted like distant stars. But they weren't stars. They were something else, something that shouldn't be in this place. They flickered and faded as if the world itself were decaying, crumbling away. And then I saw it. The road. Not a real road, but a path, an outline, a direction in the chaos. It was leading somewhere. The car was moving toward it, like it had found its destination. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to know what lay ahead. But the car kept moving, pulling me forward. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't fight it. The air grew colder still, and the darkness deepened. The road ahead stretched endlessly into the void, but as I stared into it, I saw something else. Something in the distance. A shape. It was hard to make out at first, but then it became clear. Another car. But it wasn't just any car. It was a mirror of mine, a twisted version of the one I was in. Its headlights were dim, flickering like dying stars, and the car was moving in the opposite direction. Toward me. It wasn't moving on the road. It was gliding, like mine. And as it drew closer, I saw it. The driver. There was no face, no body, just a dark silhouette in the driver's seat. I could feel it now, the pull between us. The car, the driverless car, was leading me to that other car. And I knew, with terrifying certainty, that I had to face it. That I had to reach it. The car accelerated, faster and faster, hurtling toward the shadowed vehicle ahead. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was dry, my body numb. All I could do was watch as the distance between us closed. And then, in a blink, the two cars were no longer separate. They collided, not with a crash, but with a sudden, overwhelming pressure that sent a shock through my body. The world around me shattered, as if everything was breaking apart. And then, nothing. I don't know how long I was out. Time didn't seem to exist in this place anymore. When I came to, I was back on the street. My car was gone. The darkness was gone. But there was something else now. A presence. A voice. You're still here. And I knew then, with a cold certainty, that I would never leave. Have you ever been alone in a building when the silence is so heavy you begin to hear things that aren't there? It was late, way past working hours, and the office I was in should have been empty. The usual buzz of activity, the hum of conversations, had faded hours ago. The only sounds that remained were the faint tapping of my keyboard and the occasional hum of the lights above. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. But I liked it. It was peaceful in a way. I've always been one to work late. Deadlines, unfinished tasks, the quiet solitude, something about it allowed me to focus, to think clearly. But tonight, there was something different. Something I couldn't place. It started slowly. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A rustling noise in the hallway. A faint murmur, like voices floating in from a distant room. I paused, listening carefully, but there was nothing. Just the regular sounds of the building, settling into the stillness of the night. I tried to focus again, my fingers returning to the keyboard, but the voices persisted. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. A low hum, like the faint whisper of a conversation just out of reach. I could hear words, but they were too garbled to make out. The strange thing was, they sounded familiar. I sat back in my chair, my heartbeat beginning to race slightly. I looked around, but the office was empty, just like it had been for hours. No one was there. The building was supposed to be empty. I stood up from my desk, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. My office was located at the end of the hallway, away from the main entrance, where the lights flickered occasionally, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit, like a forgotten tunnel leading into nothingness. The voices grew louder. They were definitely coming from the hallway now. I couldn't make out the words, but I was sure of one thing: they sounded familiar. As if I'd heard them before. As if I knew those voices, though I couldn't place them. I hesitated for a moment, uncertainty creeping into my thoughts. Maybe it was just another late-night distraction. Maybe I was hearing things due to exhaustion. I tried to dismiss it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped into the hallway, the light from the office behind me casting a small pool of brightness on the floor. The rest of the hallway ahead was swallowed by shadows, stretching out further than usual. The air was colder here, and the silence felt heavier. It was as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting. The voices were clearer now, though still muffled, like they were coming from a room nearby. I knew I should leave, go home, forget about it, but something inside me urged me to go closer. To investigate. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps softer now. The sound of my shoes against the polished floor seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness. As I passed the empty offices, I noticed the doors were slightly ajar, their shadows spilling into the hallway, like dark eyes watching me as I walked by. The voices came from further down, around the corner. I couldn't see anyone, but they were there, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no response. Just the muffled hum of voices. I took another step forward, my heart pounding now. The hallway felt longer than before, the space around me feeling more oppressive. As I neared the corner, I noticed something else, a faint flicker of light. A shadow moving at the edge of my vision, as if someone was standing just out of sight. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow didn't move. But the voices continued, louder now, almost as if they were beckoning me. I felt my legs freeze in place. My mind screamed for me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't move. It was like my body was caught in the grip of something I couldn't understand. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The light flickered again, and the voices came into focus for the briefest of moments. It sounded like names. My name, actually. And then, someone else's. Someone I knew. The tone was strange, unfamiliar, but it felt wrong. I turned the corner, my pulse racing in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless now, the shadows darker than they should be. The voices seemed to disappear the moment I stepped into the light. I looked around, my breathing shallow, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I turned to head back, but something caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway, near the emergency exit, there was a door slightly open. The room behind it was dark, but I could swear I saw a figure standing there, just beyond the doorway. I took a step closer, my breath held tight in my chest. The door creaked as I moved toward it, and I froze, suddenly aware of how still the air had become. The voices were gone now, but the presence of something, or someone, remained. I didn't dare approach the door, but I could feel my eyes drawn to it, unable to look away. What if it was nothing? What if it was just my mind playing tricks on me? But the feeling, the one that had been creeping under my skin, told me otherwise. Something was wrong. I had to know. I stepped closer, each movement feeling heavier than the last, the shadows stretching like fingers, closing in around me. The room behind the door was silent, waiting. And I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that whatever was on the other side wasn't something I wanted to face. But it was too late to turn back now. I was already too deep into the silence. And whatever it was that had been calling my name, it wasn't going to let me go. The door creaked again, and this time it felt like a whisper, calling me closer. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, louder than any noise around me. The hallway felt impossibly narrow now, like the walls were closing in. I reached out to touch the door handle, my hand trembling, but something stopped me just before my fingers made contact. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the hallway, and I flinched. The air felt damp, and it had a strange, metallic scent. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence returned, heavier than before. But it wasn't just silence, it was expectation. I felt it in my bones, like the building itself was aware of my every move. I backed away from the door, my eyes never leaving the shadowy crack that seemed to beckon me. Something was wrong here. I couldn't quite place it, but the feeling that something, someone, was in that room, waiting, was undeniable. I turned around to head back to my office, but as I did, I heard it. The voices. At first, it was barely a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. They were closer now, just behind me, and I could swear I recognized them. My name was being called out in a tone I couldn't quite understand, yet I knew it was meant for me. It sounded like a warning or a plea, but I couldn't tell which. I spun around, my breath shallow, my eyes darting through the dim hallway. There was nothing there. No one. Just the shadows, stretching long and thin as the light above flickered once more. My mind raced. Who was calling my name? And why did it sound so familiar? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands were clammy, and the air around me felt colder by the second. The voice stopped suddenly, as though it had been cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. I knew I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there before whatever was lurking in the dark corner of that hallway reached out and grabbed me. But I couldn't. The curiosity, that unsettling pull, held me in place. I had to know what was happening. So, I turned back to the door. This time, my hand didn't hesitate as I grasped the cold metal handle. The chill that shot up my arm felt unnatural, like I was touching something wrong. I forced myself to twist the handle, pushing the door open slowly as if the slightest movement would set off something far worse than I could imagine. The door creaked louder now, almost painfully, as though the hinges themselves were protesting. The room beyond was dark, the light from the hallway barely able to pierce the gloom. It looked like a storage room, stacked with old boxes and forgotten files. But there was a strange, thick atmosphere in the air, like something had been left there for far too long. As I stepped into the room, the temperature dropped even further. My breath fogged in the air, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around myself, trying to shield against the cold. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, and the shadows were thick, pressing in on all sides. Then, I heard it again. The voices. This time, they weren't just whispers, they were right there, as though the speakers were standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I whirled around, my heart leaping in my chest, but again, no one. Just the heavy silence, thick with tension. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something. I barely managed to catch myself before falling. When I looked down, I saw an old file, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. It was open, and something was written on the inside. I knelt down, my fingers hovering over the paper. I felt an unsettling chill run through me, as if the room itself didn't want me to read whatever was inside. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I flipped the file open fully, revealing the yellowed pages inside. The handwriting was old, the ink faded, but still legible. The words on the page made my blood run cold. She never left. I froze. The room seemed to get colder, the shadows closing in on me. My breath came in short gasps, and I quickly shut the file, as though the words themselves had reached out to touch me. And then I heard it again, the voice. This time, it was clear, unmistakable. Help me. It was my voice. Or at least, it sounded like it. The same tone, the same cadence, but it wasn't mine. Not really. The sound of it, laced with something I couldn't describe, sent a wave of panic through me. I turned and rushed toward the door, but it wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, pulling it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse quickened, my breathing erratic, as I pounded on the door with my fists, desperate to get out. The air in the room grew thick with the feeling of being trapped. I felt the walls closing in, suffocating me. And then, the lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a soft sound, the creak of a chair, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps on the floor. The voices, now loud and clear, were no longer just whispers. They were alive, surrounding me, closing in from every corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it all. I didn't know who or what these voices were, but one thing was clear, I was not alone in that room. And whatever it wasn't leaving. The door behind me suddenly flew open with a force that knocked me back, and I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding through my veins. The hallway outside was empty, as it had been the entire time, but the cold presence in the room followed me. I ran, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the elevator. The lights in the building flickered again, but I didn't wait. I pressed the button, desperate for it to arrive. The door slid open, and I stepped inside, the walls closing in on me with every passing second. As the elevator descended, I glanced back at the hallway, only to see a shadow standing at the far end, watching me. And just before the doors closed, I heard it again, my voice, whispering softly through the stillness of the hallway. You can't leave. The doors slammed shut. The elevator moved slowly, its creaking cables echoing in the silence, and each floor passed with an agonizing slowness. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my hands trembled as they clutched the railing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something was following me, even as the elevator descended. The building was far too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against you, like an invisible weight, suffocating you with its stillness. As the elevator reached the ground floor, I didn't wait for the doors to fully open before I rushed out. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from that place, away from the voices, from the cold, suffocating presence that seemed to have wrapped itself around me. I didn't care if the door to the building was locked or if I was supposed to leave through the back. I ran straight for the entrance. My heart was racing, my breathing shallow, and when the automatic door slid open, I bolted outside into the cold night air. But even as I stepped into the fresh air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The streets outside were quiet, too quiet. The city was always alive at night, cars passing by, distant voices of late-night wanderers, the occasional hum of streetlights. But tonight, it was silent. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that stretched out like fingers, reaching for me. The buildings on either side stood like silent sentinels, dark and empty, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped, startled by the sudden sound. I pulled it out, hoping it was a message from someone, anyone, that could pull me back to reality. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. There was a text from my colleague, Sarah. "I saw you. You didn't leave the office. Where did you go?" I stared at the message, my mind racing. How could she have seen me? I had left. I was sure I had left the building. I glanced up at the darkened office building behind me. It loomed like a giant, its windows like hollow eyes watching me. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail from Sarah. "Hey, I don't know what's going on, but I saw you. I swear. I heard you talking in the hallway, but when I came out, you weren't there. I think you need to check your phone. Something's not right." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I opened the voicemail, the sound of Sarah's voice crackling through the speaker, her words disjointed and panicked. "I don't know what's going on, but I heard you. I heard your voice, and then you weren't there. I went looking for you, but it's like you disappeared." The message cut off abruptly. I didn't wait to hear any more. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I started walking faster, my steps hurried and uneven. The streets felt like a maze, a labyrinth with no escape, no way out. The city I had known all my life felt alien now, twisted and distorted. I needed to go home, to someplace familiar, but I wasn't sure if that would even help. Could I escape whatever this was? Could I outrun it? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked over my shoulder again. This time, I thought I saw something. A shadow, moving just at the corner of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I was being followed. I picked up my pace, the echo of my footsteps ringing out against the empty street. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my mind was spinning with fear, thoughts flashing like lightning, each more confusing than the last. I couldn't think straight. I needed to focus. But when I reached the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a car, parked across the street, its headlights glaring in the night. It was an older model, black, with tinted windows. I didn't recognize it. But the strange thing was, it wasn't parked correctly. It was angled at an odd tilt, almost as though it had been waiting for me. The car hadn't been there before. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on it, and then I saw it. The door of the car slowly creaked open. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, paralyzed. I could hear the faintest sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching me from the car. Each step echoed in the quiet night, and I felt my heart pounding harder than ever. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. The figure that emerged from the car was tall, wearing a dark coat. I couldn't make out any details about their face, just the silhouette moving toward me with a steady, relentless pace. I wanted to call out, to ask who they were, but my voice failed me. And then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, they stopped. They were mere feet from me now, standing in the street, but still far enough that I couldn't see their face. My legs were shaking beneath me, and the urge to run was stronger than ever. But I couldn't. The figure reached into their coat and pulled something out. It glinted in the dim light, a shiny, metallic object. And then they started walking toward me again. I took a step back, then another and another, until I was pressed up against the side of a building, my heart racing in my chest. The figure stopped just a few feet away, and I could finally see the object they were holding. It was a phone. They raised it to their ear, and I heard a voice. My voice. "You can't escape," the voice said, cold and distant, as though it was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I didn't need to hear anything more. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping, not looking back. The world around me seemed to warp, the street twisting and stretching, the shadows following me, never letting me escape. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I would never be free. My feet slapped the cold pavement, and my breath came in ragged gasps. My body screamed for rest, for a moment of respite, but I couldn't stop. Every step felt like it might be my last. The shadows stretched ahead of me, as if the night itself was chasing me. I dared not glance behind, but I could feel them there, always just out of view, waiting. I reached the nearest subway station, and without thinking, I bolted down the stairs. The familiar scent of stale air and metallic echoes filled my senses, but this time it only made everything feel more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on me, and every distant hum of the train tracks felt like a reminder of how trapped I was. The train was coming, its lights flickering in the distance. I rushed toward the platform, my mind focused only on getting away from whatever was pursuing me. But as I stood there, waiting, the realization hit me with the force of a punch. I didn't know where I was running anymore. I hadn't been to this part of the city in months, maybe even years. I had no idea if this subway line would even lead me home, or if I was just running deeper into the unknown. Panic clawed at my chest, but I pushed it down. I had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. The train pulled into the station, its doors opening with a soft hiss. I stepped inside, eyes darting around, scanning the empty car. It was completely silent, and the dim lighting did little to ease the cold knot forming in my stomach. The doors slid shut behind me, and the train jolted forward, the motion sending a ripple of nausea through me. I found a seat near the back and sat down, pressing my back against the cool metal of the train. My hands gripped the edge of the seat, and I tried to steady my breath. This should have been a relief. I was moving away from that dark figure, from the voices in the hall. But the truth was, I couldn't escape it. I had the feeling that wherever I went, it would follow. As the train rumbled through the tunnels, I tried to force my mind to calm down. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to think. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing there, holding that phone. I heard my own voice, cold and unnatural, saying things I hadn't said. Things I didn't understand. A soft click echoed through the train, and I jolted upright. The sound was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my heart leap into my throat. It came from somewhere near the front of the car. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes scanning the empty seats. The car was still eerily quiet. But then I saw it. A small, glowing screen was visible through the gaps in the seats ahead of me. Someone was watching a phone. I could see the soft blue light flickering in the dark, moving as if someone were scrolling through it. But no one was sitting there. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the screen, and then I saw it. A message popped up on the screen. The words were simple, but they made my blood run cold. I'm still here. My breath caught in my throat, and I instantly reached for my phone, pulling it out of my pocket. There were no messages. Nothing. I looked back at the screen, but it was gone. The phone had vanished, leaving only the empty seat. The train slid into the next station with a screech, jolting me out of my frozen stupor. The doors opened, and I quickly stood, my hands shaking as I gripped my phone tighter. I had to get off. I had to get out. But as I moved toward the door, something caught my eye. A figure stood at the end of the platform, silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights. Tall, dark, and still. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew who it was. It was the same figure, the same cold, hollow presence. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. The figure took a slow step forward, then another. The train doors closed with a soft ding, but I didn't notice. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like I was stuck in place, frozen by fear, paralyzed by the knowledge that I was being hunted, and there was nowhere to hide. Then, the figure raised something in its hand. A phone. My phone. I didn't think. I bolted for the doors, slamming my body into them as they opened just in time. My feet hit the platform with a sickening thud, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself before I fell flat on the ground. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and steady. The figure was moving again. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The station was different from the one I had entered. This one was dimly lit, almost abandoned. The tiles on the walls were cracked, and the lights flickered as if they were about to go out. There was no one around. No one to help me. I ran toward the stairs, ignoring the sharp pain in my side. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I had to get away. But when I reached the top of the stairs, the door was locked. The sound of footsteps was louder now, closer. I pressed myself against the cold, metal door, my breath shallow, panic rising in my chest. I wasn't going to make it. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was mine. You can't escape. You'll never escape. The words echoed around me, bouncing off the walls, filling my head. I turned around, but no one was there. The figure was gone. But I knew one thing for certain, it was never really gone. I couldn't escape. And I couldn't run forever. The voices would always follow. I was trapped. The weight of the words hung in the air, suffocating me, as if the very atmosphere had thickened into something heavy and oppressive. I couldn't think clearly. My mind was in chaos, my body trembling with fear. The station around me seemed to blur into an indistinct mass, its walls stretching and narrowing, closing in like a giant, suffocating fist. I had no idea where I was anymore, or how I had gotten here. I couldn't escape. I ran my hands over my face, trying to force myself to focus. The voice, the one that had come from my own mouth, still echoed in my ears. You can't escape. You'll never escape. I couldn't shake it, couldn't get rid of it. Was it real? Was it me, or something else? The line between the two had blurred so completely that I didn't know which way was up anymore. I backed away from the locked door, my heart racing. There had to be another way out. I couldn't stay here. Not with that presence, that figure, the one I knew was still out there, watching, waiting. Suddenly, I heard it again. The soft click. I whipped around, my body tense, ready to flee. But there was no one in sight. The air was still, too still. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt a creeping dread curling in the pit of my stomach. The silence was almost suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I took a step forward, then another, moving cautiously toward the far end of the platform. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe a train to come roaring into the station, maybe someone to appear from the shadows, maybe even a sudden escape route I hadn't seen before. But nothing happened. The platform remained empty, quiet, frozen in time. Another click. It was louder this time, unmistakable. I spun on my heels, my breath caught in my throat. And then I saw it. A phone. A glowing screen, casting a faint blue light in the dimness, just like before. But this time, it was lying on the ground, face up, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The same phone I had seen in the figure's hand. I took a cautious step toward it, my body moving almost without thought. I had to know. I couldn't ignore it. I reached down, my fingers brushing the cold surface of the screen. And that's when I felt it. A chill, icy and sharp, like an invisible hand pressing against my spine. A low hum filled the air, a sound so faint I could barely hear it, but it was there. It was all around me. The shadows seemed to shift, to stretch further than they should have, like the very light was bending, warping. And then the screen flickered to life. I jumped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The words appeared, one after another, like a message waiting for me. It's time. My breath caught. The voice from the phone wasn't mine. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it felt so familiar. Cold, detached, as though it had no regard for my fear, no care for my existence. I looked around the platform again. There was still no one. No figure, no shadowy presence. But I knew they were there. Somewhere. Watching me. I needed to leave. I needed to find a way out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face it again. But as I turned to leave, something stopped me. The voice. It was back. But this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was in the air. You've been running long enough. I froze. The voice was closer now, like it was coming from right behind me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I whirled around, panic flooding my veins. And there it was. The figure. Standing at the far end of the platform, just as it had been before, only now it was different. The air around it shimmered, like a distortion in reality itself. The shadows twisted unnaturally, and I could feel the ground beneath me vibrating, as though the very fabric of the world was warping. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, my voice trapped in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with its unseen eyes. I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating. The air was thick with tension, with a suffocating weight that pressed in on me from all sides. And then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk. It just shifted, sliding through the shadows like smoke, its form flickering in and out of focus. It was faster than I could comprehend, closing the distance between us in an instant. I took a step back, stumbling, but I didn't run. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, my body unwilling to obey. The figure stopped just a few feet in front of me. Its presence was overpowering, filling the space with an unnatural coldness. And then, finally, it spoke. "It's over." The words hung in the air, final, irreversible. I closed my eyes, unable to look at it anymore. I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, the fear, the darkness, the uncertainty. I was trapped in this place, in this moment. I couldn't escape. And that's when I heard it. The click of a phone. It was mine. I opened my eyes, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a flash of recognition in the figure's face, if it even had one. But then it was gone. The train arrived, the doors opening to a pitch-black void. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Have you ever felt like someone was following you, but when you turned around, no one was there? It was early, just as the sun began to break through the horizon, casting the streets in a pale light. I was on my usual morning jog, trying to clear my head before work, just like any other day. The quiet streets felt oddly still, except for the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement and my steady breathing. I always loved these moments, the calm before the world fully woke up. But this morning felt different. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was nearing the edge of the park when I heard it, the soft thud of footsteps behind me. Nothing unusual at first. After all, I wasn't the only one who exercised at this hour. But then, something caught my attention. The steps didn't match my pace. They were slightly out of sync, a little too close, too deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat. Maybe someone had just crossed my path, or I was hearing things. I shrugged it off and kept running, trying to shake off the unease building in my chest. But the footsteps, they continued. They were still there, just behind me, soft but persistent. Almost as if someone was trying to stay close without getting too close, just enough to make their presence known without revealing themselves. I stopped, my breath coming in quick bursts, my eyes scanning the empty road behind me. There was no one. Just the empty sidewalk, the same as before. I waited for a few seconds, then started jogging again, this time more cautiously, every step feeling heavier. But the footsteps didn't stop. I sped up slightly, hoping to outrun whatever was following me, but the sound of the footsteps remained steady, matching my pace exactly, as if the stranger behind me was mimicking my every move. I could hear them clearer now, the soft rhythm of shoes on pavement. But when I turned around, I saw nothing but the empty path behind me. It was as if I was being hunted by an invisible presence. I tried to ignore it, to keep running, but the unease grew. My heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath hitched in my throat as I glanced back again, certain now that someone was following me. But again, there was no one there. The street remained empty, the shadows stretched long in the morning light. Nothing but the sound of my own pounding heartbeat in my ears. I kept running, faster this time. The sound of the footsteps seemed to quicken with me, always a few steps behind. It was no longer just a passing sound, it felt like a presence, something real, something tangible. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around and confront whatever it was that stalked me, but my body refused to obey. The more I ran, the louder the steps became. They echoed in my mind, matching my movements, closing in. I could feel the weight of them, the presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I couldn't escape. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my chest tightening with each desperate breath. The footsteps were now so loud, so close, that I could almost feel the air shift behind me, as if someone were right there, mere inches away. But when I turned again, I was still alone. The path ahead stretched out like an endless void, dark and empty. And then, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. A figure, just a blur, standing at the far end of the park. My heart stopped. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a trick of the light. I slowed, my steps faltering, my body trembling from the adrenaline coursing through me. Was someone really there? Or was this all in my mind? But as I took a hesitant step forward, I felt it. The breath of someone, or something, on the back of my neck. Cold. Too cold. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. No one. I stood there, frozen, my breath shallow and quick, the sound of the footsteps now so close, they seemed to be right next to me. But when I looked around, there was nothing. No one. The street was empty again, like it had been when I first started my run. I didn't know how long I stood there, straining my ears, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Was I losing my mind? Or was something real out there, something I couldn't see? I turned and ran again, faster this time, until my legs screamed in protest. The footsteps followed, matching my pace with an eerie precision. And I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound of the footsteps was now undeniable, so loud and clear that I could almost feel the presence behind me, breathing in rhythm with my own. Each step was like a drumbeat, sending waves of unease through my body. The street ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar pavement now alien and unsettling. I could hear my heart pounding, thudding in my ears, but still, the steps never faltered. I glanced over my shoulder again, but the road remained as empty as before. There was no one, no shadowy figure, no sign of life anywhere. I tried to focus on the sounds around me, the wind rustling the trees, the distant hum of the city, but it all faded in comparison to the relentless footsteps. They were so close now, almost touching me. It was as if whoever, or whatever it was walking just behind me, a breath away. I turned onto another street, hoping the change in direction would throw whatever was following me off, but the footsteps followed. The same steady rhythm, the same eerie consistency. My legs burned, and my breathing became more erratic, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the sound. It wasn't normal. I knew it wasn't. I could hear the crunch of gravel beneath someone's shoes, the soft tapping of steps against the concrete, all perfectly timed to match mine. But when I looked, there was no one in sight. It felt as though I was being hunted, stalked by an unseen predator. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching, waiting. I glanced at the windows of the buildings I passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone walking along the street or maybe a car passing by. But the windows were all dark, the buildings lifeless in the morning haze. The world outside my little bubble seemed empty, as though it had all been erased. Just me and the footsteps. I pushed harder, my mind spiraling. What if it wasn't just someone running behind me? What if it was something else? My thoughts raced, every scenario playing out in my head. Was it some kind of prank? Some sick joke? But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. I reached a quieter part of town, the streets lined with old buildings and trees, their branches hanging low, casting long shadows. The footsteps kept pace with me, growing louder with each stride. I glanced over my shoulder once more desperate now. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. Then, in the distance, I saw a figure, a silhouette against the soft light of the morning. My heart skipped. I wasn't imagining things. There was someone up ahead, walking toward me, slowly. The footsteps behind me didn't stop. They continued, still matching my pace. But now there was this figure in front of me, and for a moment, I thought they might be the one causing the noise. But as I neared them, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was no one there. The figure was a mirage, an illusion, flickering like a shadow that couldn't quite settle into reality. I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood draining from my face. I was alone. Completely alone. I spun around to look behind me, but the footsteps were still there, as loud and close as ever. I could hear the air shift, like someone was right behind me, breathing down my neck. But when I looked, there was nothing. The road stretched on, desolate and quiet. I was frozen, my body trembling, unsure of what to do next. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the empty street, the sound of the footsteps filling my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for the next step, the next sound, the next movement. But there was nothing. The street was silent, the world still, as though the universe itself had paused. Had I imagined it all? Was I going crazy? I took a tentative step forward, then another, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The air felt heavy, thick with the absence of sound. I was still standing in the middle of the street, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, creeping across the pavement, moving toward me. It wasn't cast by any streetlight. It wasn't from a tree or a passing car. It was different. I didn't turn to face it. I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mind screaming for me to run, to get away. But my legs wouldn't move. The shadow crept closer, its edges flickering like a flame in the wind. I could feel it. It was right behind me again. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. My chest tightened, and my legs trembled, refusing to move. The shadow continued to advance, now casting an unnatural shape across the street, its edges flickering and warping, as if it wasn't fully part of this world. I could feel it closing in on me, like a suffocating pressure pressing against my back. The footsteps started again. Slow at first, distant, as if testing the air, then they quickened, matching my heartbeat, pounding relentlessly in my ears. I could feel the rhythm deep in my bones. Whoever, or whatever it was here again, this time closer than ever. I didn't dare to look over my shoulder. The shadow had already moved, now directly behind me, its presence almost tangible. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words stuck in my throat. The only sound I could manage was a strangled gasp, swallowed by the oppressive silence that enveloped me. The footsteps were coming closer, echoing louder with each passing second. I knew I couldn't just stand here. I had to move. But every instinct in my body told me that the moment I turned around, the thing behind me would be right there, face to face. But there was no time to think. I forced my feet to move, my body acting on sheer panic. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the empty street, the sound of my own footsteps drowning out the others, if only for a moment. But then, as if mocking my attempt to escape, the other footsteps grew louder, faster, just behind me. I could feel them gaining on me. The shadow was right there now, mere inches away. Its presence was cold and wrong, like a dark hole in the fabric of reality. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape. I made a sharp turn down a narrow alley, hoping the maze of buildings would block whatever was following me. But as I rounded the corner, the steps were right there, echoing off the walls, so close I could almost feel the air shift. I turned again, desperate, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The oppressive silence was deafening. I froze, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart raced. I stood still, listening for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The alley was empty, the street ahead deserted. It was as if the entire world had gone quiet. My mind screamed at me to move, to get away from this place, but my body refused to obey. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The street was the same, only more oppressive now. The buildings seemed to loom over me, their windows dark and hollow. The world around me felt wrong. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was faint at first, a low murmur, like someone whispering from a distance. The voice was distorted, almost as if it wasn't human, but there was something in it, a familiarity that made my blood run cold. It was a voice I knew, a voice I had heard countless times before. It was my own. The whispering grew louder, now clear and unmistakable. It was a distorted echo of my own voice, calling my name, repeating it over and over, each time closer, more insistent. Run. I spun around, panic setting in. There was no one there, no one to be seen, but the voice was still there, right beside me, in my ear, as if it were coming from within my own mind. Run, run, run. I was paralyzed with fear, my body shaking, but my legs wouldn't move. The words echoed through me, each repetition digging deeper into my soul. I was being hunted, trapped in a nightmare where the lines between reality and something far darker blurred. I had to move. I had to get out of here. I pushed myself forward, stumbling, my feet dragging, but still, the sound of my own voice followed me, urging me to run, to escape. The footsteps started up again, closer now, too close. I could hear them behind me, like they were mocking my every step, pulling me towards something I didn't want to face. My thoughts raced, every possible explanation running through my mind, but none of it made sense. The shadow, the footsteps, the voice, they weren't real. They couldn't be. But the terror I felt, the cold grip of something watching me, was all too real. I turned a corner, only to be met with another alley, another dead end. My pulse surged in panic. There was no way out. No way to escape. I was trapped in this maze, with whatever was following me closing in. The footsteps stopped. I stopped, breathless, listening, trying to hear any sign of movement, any clue as to where it might be. but there was nothing. Then I heard it again. A whisper, soft, almost tender, right behind me. "Now, you're mine." I turned around. I was frozen in place, my body rigid with fear, my mind scrambling to comprehend what I had just heard. "Now, you're mine." The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with a dark, sinister energy. My breath caught in my throat, and I dared not turn around. I felt it, something was there. Something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like it was about to swallow me whole. For a moment, the world went silent. No footsteps. No whispers. Just the beating of my heart in my ears, thundering louder with each passing second. I felt a presence, though heavy, like it was looming just behind me. Watching. Waiting. I knew I couldn't stand there any longer. I forced my legs to move, taking a few stumbling steps forward, my breath shallow and ragged. The pavement felt uneven beneath my sneakers, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath my feet. The air around me felt thick, pressing in on all sides, making every breath a struggle. I had to escape. I had to run. The moment I began to move, I heard it again. The footsteps. Faint at first, then gradually growing louder, growing faster, mirroring my own frantic pace. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning with every step. The alley stretched before me, an endless tunnel of shadows and empty windows. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps were right there, just behind me, following in my wake. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, the alley split into two paths. One led into the unknown, the other seemed to loop back toward where I had come from. I didn't think. I just veered left, desperate to break free from the suffocating darkness. But as soon as I turned, I stumbled. The pavement beneath me seemed to give way, and I fell, my hands scraping against the rough surface. The pain was sharp, but I barely registered it. I had to get up. I had to keep moving. I pushed myself to my feet, gasping for air, but the footsteps, they were gone. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural. A deep, suffocating quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the city that now seemed so far away. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The air was too still, the darkness too deep. My senses were screaming at me that I was not alone. That something was waiting. I looked around. The alley seemed endless now. The walls were taller than they should have been, the shadows too long, stretching in ways they shouldn't. I was lost, disoriented. I had to find my way out. I had to get back to the street, back to the lights, to safety. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the alley. It was shrouded in darkness, barely more than a silhouette against the faint light from the street. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching. My heart stuttered in my chest. This thing was not like anything I had ever seen. It wasn't human. It didn't belong here, in this world. The silence between us stretched, and for a moment, I thought I might be able to run again. But my legs wouldn't obey me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It didn't seem to be moving, but I could feel its presence in my mind, its weight pressing on me, suffocating me. Then, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't from behind me. It was from the figure. Low, raspy, like it was speaking from the depths of a forgotten grave. "Why are you running?" it asked. The voice wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a cold, unnerving sensation that crawled into my skin and made my blood run cold. I couldn't answer. My mouth felt dry. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot by fear. I could only stare at it, this thing that was more shadow than substance, its shape shifting and warping in the dim light. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to grow, to expand, like it was pulling the darkness around it into itself. It took a step toward me. I gasped, the sound escaping my lips before I could stop it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The thing was moving closer now, its form becoming more solid with each step, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, twisting at unnatural angles, its head too large for its body, its face a blank void. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them, cold, hungry. I turned to run, and this time, my legs obeyed. My feet pounded against the pavement, my breath ragged and desperate, but no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, the thing was always there, just behind me. Its footsteps were a constant, relentless rhythm, a cruel reminder that I could not escape. I could hear it whispering again, low and guttural, right behind me. "You can't run from me." The sound of my own breathing was drowned out by the deafening echo of the thing's words. Each step, each whisper, seemed to drive me further into madness, until I couldn't tell if I was running from it or running toward it. I didn't know where I was going anymore. All I knew was that I had to keep running. But there was nowhere to run to. My legs burned, my chest ached with every frantic breath I took, but still, I ran. The alley twisted and turned in ways I couldn't explain, as if it were changing around me, reshaping itself to keep me trapped. Every corner I rounded felt like another dead end, another hopeless stretch of endless darkness. The figure behind me was still there. I could hear it. It was no longer a series of footsteps, but a slow, deliberate, rhythmic sound, like it was savoring every second of my terror. Every time I stole a glance over my shoulder, I saw it closer. No longer a distant silhouette, now it was a shadow I could almost touch, with its unnaturally long limbs swaying in the still air. I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged, but it was no use. The fear that gripped me now wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something worse, something primal. The longer I ran, the less I could feel the ground beneath my feet, like I was losing touch with reality itself. The pavement beneath me seemed to melt, the walls closing in, distorting in ways that made my head spin. Then, just as I was sure my legs would give way, I stumbled. I fell to the ground, scraping my palms against the rough surface. My heart hammered in my chest, and panic surged through me like a cold, poisonous tide. I didn't even try to get up. My body was numb, my mind too consumed with the overwhelming dread that the figure was now towering over me, just inches away. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The alley was empty. My breath hitched in my throat, and I stared at the ground in disbelief. The fear didn't subside, it grew, deepened, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I knew it wasn't over. That thing, it hadn't left. It was still here. Somewhere. Watching. The silence around me was suffocating. I couldn't hear anything except the deafening rush of my pulse in my ears. The world seemed too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood up, trembling. My knees wobbled as I pushed myself to my feet, my body feeling as if it might collapse at any moment. I glanced around, trying to make sense of the disorienting emptiness of the alley. And then I saw it. The same thing I had seen earlier, the dark, twisted figure standing at the far end of the alley, watching me. I should have screamed, I should have run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey my mind's frantic commands. The figure took a step toward me, and another, its movements slow and deliberate. I felt something shift within me, a sudden, desperate surge of clarity. This was it. This was the moment I had been trying to outrun. It wasn't just a figure or a shadow. It was a presence. A thing from somewhere far beyond this world, far beyond the realm of the living. I wasn't just being chased. I was being hunted. Why do you run? The voice came again, this time echoing from all around me, the words vibrating through the very air. I felt the words deep within me, like they were not just spoken but embedded into my bones, into my soul. You can't escape me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. In that moment, I understood. The thing wasn't just following me, it was part of me. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every step I took. The alley dissolved around me, and suddenly, I was standing in the middle of an endless void. There were no walls, no ground, no sky. Just darkness. Deep, endless darkness. The figure was still there, but now it wasn't alone. There were others, more figures, emerging from the blackness, their forms shifting, stretching, warping. They weren't real. They couldn't be. But as they surrounded me, their presence was undeniable, suffocating. You cannot outrun what you are, one of them whispered, its voice like a rasping wind. You cannot escape your own fear. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me. My breath was ragged, and I felt the weight of all my past mistakes, all my insecurities, all the things I had tried to outrun in my life, pressing down on me. The fear wasn't just in the alley. It wasn't just in the dark figure. It was inside me. The world around me began to close in, the figures drawing closer, their whispers rising in a chaotic crescendo. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The walls of reality were falling away, and I was left with nothing but the darkness and them. I had been running all this time, but now I knew the truth. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't outrun myself. And in that moment, the darkness swallowed me whole. Have you ever stepped onto a bus, certain of your destination, only to find that the world around you isn't quite what it seems? It was late, too late, really. I had missed the last few buses and was now standing at the edge of the station, the dim light from a single flickering street lamp casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air was crisp, a sharp reminder of the fall season, but there was something else, something unsettling about the emptiness of the night. I checked my watch again, hoping it was wrong. But no, it was almost midnight. The bus I needed, the one that would take me home, was never on time, but I had learned to expect it at this hour. So, when I saw the headlights cut through the fog down the road, I thought nothing of it. I stood up a little straighter, taking a step forward. The bus was coming. But as it rolled to a stop, something felt off. The way it pulled up, it was too quiet. Normally, buses rumbled, their engines humming with life, but this one? It was silent. Dead silent. I hesitated for a moment, feeling that strange twinge in my gut, but shrugged it off. Maybe the engine had just been recently tuned, or maybe it was just how the night felt. I stepped forward and climbed aboard. The interior was dark, the lights overhead barely flickering. The bus was empty, completely empty, except for the driver. I nodded in his direction as I paid the fare. He didn't respond, just gave me a single, curt nod back. He looked strange, but I couldn't put my finger on why. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes were obscured by the dim light. Still, I didn't think much of it. People were odd sometimes. I sat down in the back, letting out a sigh as I sank into the warm leather seat. My mind wandered. How much longer would it take to get home? Would I be able to get some sleep before work in the morning? The bus began to move. It was smooth, too smooth. It didn't jerk or grind into motion like it usually did. The road outside the window was unfamiliar. This wasn't my usual route. But I assumed the driver had taken a shortcut, or maybe the road had been rerouted. The streets looked almost identical, old, narrow, with familiar houses lined up on either side, but something about it felt off. The bus slowed down, and I looked up, expecting to see a familiar stop. Instead, I saw nothing but darkness ahead. No streetlights. No signs of life. Just an endless stretch of road fading into the night. The sound of the engine had become strangely muffled. I pushed myself upright. "Excuse me," I called to the driver. "This isn't my stop." There was no response. "Excuse me," I repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. My heart began to race. I felt the tension in my body, like an instinct telling me to get off the bus, to leave before things went any further. But the doors wouldn't open. I looked around frantically, trying to find an emergency exit, anything to get out. The road was empty. The windows were covered with fog, thick and swirling as if they were holding something back. And then, as if I had imagined it, the bus came to a sudden stop. "Get off," I whispered to myself. But my hands wouldn't move. I stood, trembling, and made my way to the front of the bus. The driver remained still, his face now obscured by the shadows of his seat. I leaned forward to speak to him, but then he was gone. The seat was empty. Panic gripped me, and I backed away from the front, my mind racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the aisle as the bus doors finally opened just as I had reached them. But what I saw on the outside wasn't what I expected. The station, the familiar station where I had boarded, was gone. There was nothing but empty road and darkness stretching into the distance. I ran off the bus, breathless, my mind screaming to get away. But before I could take a single step, the bus doors slammed shut behind me. The engine roared to life with a deafening screech, but as I turned around, the bus simply vanished. Gone. It wasn't like it had driven away, it just disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was nothing. No sound, no trace of its existence, just the lingering taste of fear and confusion in the cold night air. I stood frozen for a moment, the night completely still around me. Then, as if by instinct, I turned and ran in the opposite direction. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All that mattered was that I had to get away. Every step felt like a dream, like I was running through a place I wasn't meant to be. My thoughts were scattered. How could something like this happen? Where had the bus gone? The road ahead remained the same, dark, quiet, and unfamiliar. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on me. I had to get back to safety. But I knew deep down that nothing would ever feel safe again. Not after what I had just seen. The darkness had swallowed the bus, and with it, any chance of understanding. What had happened to me? What had happened to the bus? And why? Why did it feel like I was the one who had disappeared, too? The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just a bad dream. Maybe I had fallen asleep on the bus and imagined the whole thing. It wasn't unusual for me to be exhausted after long days at work, and my mind had a way of playing tricks when I was tired. But the feeling, that unshakable unease, lingered with me as I went through my morning routine. The fog outside the window felt heavier than usual, as if it was holding something back. I told myself it was just the weather, but deep down, I knew I couldn't forget what had happened. I had to go to work, of course. The bus was the only way to get there, and I couldn't afford to be late. But the thought of stepping onto that bus again made my stomach turn. Would it happen again? Would the same thing repeat itself? Would I find myself lost in some dark, twisted version of my city, unable to return? By the time I left the house, the world outside felt strangely quiet. The streets were empty, and the usual hum of life, the chatter of people, the sound of cars passing, was absent. Only the low hum of my footsteps accompanied me as I made my way to the bus stop. I checked the time. It was the same time as yesterday, right before the bus had come, right before it had all gone wrong. My breath quickened as I looked down the street, half expecting to see that same bus roll around the corner. But nothing. Just the familiar emptiness. The wait felt longer than usual. The chill in the air made it difficult to focus, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to be behind me. But the street remained as silent as ever. When the bus finally arrived, it was almost a relief. I stepped forward, my feet heavier than I remembered them being the day before. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off about this bus, about the world, and I was too afraid to even question it. I paid my fare, the same driver sitting in the same seat. His eyes were hidden in shadow again, but this time I could see the faint outline of his figure as I climbed aboard. My heart raced. I didn't take a seat this time. I stood, my eyes constantly flicking toward the door, the windows, as if I was waiting for something to happen. Waiting for it to happen again. The bus began to move. But there was no eerie silence this time. No strange stillness in the air. The sound of the engine was normal, the tires humming against the road. The route seemed ordinary enough. But I couldn't stop looking out the window, my nerves screaming at me to pay attention. I watched as the familiar landmarks passed by, hoping for some sign that this was just another ride. That everything was fine. But as the bus turned a corner, I saw something strange. A street sign. I was sure I had never seen it before. It was only a brief glimpse, but my mind clung to it. Something about that sign felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I blinked, but when I looked again, the sign was gone. It had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Stop thinking about it, I told myself, gripping the seat in front of me. But I couldn't help it. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the way the air felt heavier with every passing second. The bus slowed. I glanced up, expecting to see my stop approaching. But instead, I saw an unfamiliar intersection ahead. There were no buildings, no houses. Just trees. Tall, dark trees that seemed to stretch up toward the sky, blocking out the light. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the usual route. This wasn't even close. I moved toward the front, my legs shaking, my mouth dry. "Excuse me," I whispered to the driver. "This isn't where I'm supposed to be." No response. Just the low hum of the engine. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then, in the corner of my eye, I saw something, or rather, someone, standing in the shadows between the trees. It was hard to make out. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but it was there. Watching. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to tell the driver, to ask what was going on, but my voice failed me. The figure remained motionless, like a part of the night itself. And then, without warning, the bus turned off the road. I stumbled, catching myself on the nearest seat as the world outside seemed to dissolve into an endless stretch of darkness. No streetlights. No signs. Just the thick, suffocating fog that had enveloped everything. The bus was no longer following a route. It was just drifting. I pressed my hands against the cool window, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. "Please, stop," I whispered under my breath. "Please, let me off." But the bus continued, faster now, as if the road itself was pulling it forward. The figure from the trees was gone. But something told me it hadn't left. It was out there, waiting for me. The bus sped through the darkness, and I had no idea where it was going. The road outside had become a blur, a dark stretch of nothingness. It was as if we were moving through a world that didn't exist, one that had been erased from memory, swallowed by the night. I looked around, trying to keep calm. The other passengers were motionless, silent. Were there even other passengers? It was hard to tell in the dim light. The shadows in the bus seemed deeper, the silence suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized I hadn't heard a single breath, a single movement. I was alone. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and slowly walked towards the front of the bus. The driver's seat was empty. There was no one there. I reached the doors, my fingers trembling as I tried to open them. The cold metal felt foreign, like it didn't belong to the bus. I pulled harder, but they wouldn't budge. The bus kept moving, faster now, as if it had a will of its own. Panic surged through me. I turned back to the aisle, my breath shallow. The walls of the bus seemed to close in around me, suffocating. I couldn't see any way out, and the fog outside was so thick that it felt like we were traveling through an endless void. I pressed my hand to the window again, desperate for any sign of something familiar, but all I saw was the same unbroken stretch of fog. I had to get off. I had to find a way out. I turned back to the front of the bus, where the driver's seat should have been, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It was clear, standing in the aisle at the far end of the bus, its head tilted slightly, watching me. My heart stopped. The same tall, dark figure from before, standing motionless as if it had always been there. I froze. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the very presence of the figure was pulling all warmth and light from the world. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I wanted to scream, but the words were caught in my throat. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't walk like a person, it glided, as if it was part of the air, part of the darkness itself. With each step, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath now, thin clouds of mist rising in front of me. The figure was getting closer. I backed away, my legs shaking beneath me. There was nowhere to run. The doors wouldn't open, and the windows were locked tight. I was trapped, caught in this nightmare. Suddenly, the bus lurched. It wasn't just the usual bumps of the road, this was different. The wheels screeched against the pavement, the engine groaned as if it was struggling against something, fighting to stay on course. Then, everything stopped. The bus came to a complete halt, and the silence that followed was deafening. The figure had vanished, leaving only the cold, empty space where it had been. I stood there, breathing heavily, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I looked around. Nothing. No sign of the figure, no sounds, just the unsettling quiet of the bus in the middle of nowhere. I tried the doors again, my fingers numb as I yanked on the handle. Still nothing. The panic that had gripped me only moments before was now a dull ache, a heavy weight on my chest. What was happening? Why couldn't I leave? That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned toward the aisle again, my heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but no one was there. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows in the corners of the bus twisting and shifting. The sound of the footsteps grew faster, closer, until they were almost right behind me. I spun around. There, just inches away from me, stood the figure. It was closer now, its features still hidden in darkness, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against my skin. It was taller than I remembered, its outline more defined in the dim light. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't look away. There was something about it that held me, as if it had power over me. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, it spoke. You shouldn't have gotten on. The words echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud but felt deep within, a bone-chilling whisper that shook me to my core. I couldn't breathe. The fog outside pressed against the windows, darker and more oppressive than ever. The bus felt like it was suffocating me, like it had become a prison, and I was its only occupant. You can't leave, it said again, the words curling around me like a physical force. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The windows, the emergency exit, all of it remained sealed. I was trapped, suffocating in the dark, empty space, with no escape. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. The world outside the bus was still and silent, but the sound of the footsteps continued, never stopping, always following. You're not leaving. And I knew, deep down, that it was right. There was no leaving. I was stuck in this place, in this moment, forever. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has lost all meaning in this place. I could feel my mind starting to fray at the edges, every passing second stretching into infinity. The bus has not moved since that moment when it came to a halt. It's like we're suspended in some liminal space, somewhere between worlds, between waking and sleeping. The world outside is still and thick with fog, the air oppressive, like it's trying to suffocate me. I can't escape. The footsteps, slow, relentless, still echo through the bus, even though I can't see anyone. My heart races every time they grow louder, closer. I tell myself it's my mind playing tricks, but I know it's not. I can feel it. The presence is there, always just beyond my vision. I sit, or maybe I'm lying down, I'm not sure anymore, and try to keep my thoughts straight. I force myself to breathe slowly, to concentrate on something, anything, to break through the panic. My hands are cold, my fingertips numb as I grip the edges of the seat, trying to steady myself. The figure is still out there, watching, waiting. I can hear its breath now, but not with my ears. It's like it's inside my head, inside my chest. A low, rasping sound that matches the pounding of my heart. I close my eyes, but the sensation is still there. It feels like it's pressing against my soul, slowly crushing me under its weight. I sit up and glance out the window. I don't know why. I guess I'm hoping that the world outside will offer some answer. Some hope. But it's the same as it's been for hours, or is it days? The fog is thick, suffocating, swirling like a slow-moving current. There's nothing there, nothing to see. No landmarks, no familiar shapes. Just endless white. The bus lurches again. This time, it's different. The sound is deeper, like the vehicle is straining under a terrible weight. I hear a groan, a metallic squeal, and then a soft thud. The bus shakes, as though something heavy is pressing against the outside, trying to force its way in. I stand up, my body trembling, and move toward the front. My legs feel weak, as though they're not quite my own. When I reach the door, I feel a strange pressure against my chest. My breath catches in my throat, and I know something is wrong. Something is coming. I don't want to look, but I can't help myself. I turn toward the back of the bus, my body stiff with fear. The shadow in the corner is growing. It's not a figure anymore, it's a shape, shifting in dark, like it's pulling itself out of the very fabric of the bus. The footsteps stop. The air is suffocating. My skin crawls as if something is pressing against it, trying to get in. The walls of the bus feel too close, too tight. The world outside doesn't exist. There's only this, the suffocating pressure, the thick, pulsing silence, the strange, unseen presence. And then, a voice, close, far too close. You shouldn't have gotten on. The words whisper inside my head, not from the figure, not from anyone in the bus, but from the space itself. The bus. The very walls seem to be alive, pressing against me, suffocating me. I feel my legs buckle, my knees hitting the floor. The bus starts moving again, slowly at first, then faster, the engine roaring to life. I hear the wheels screeching against the pavement, but the outside world remains unchanged. The fog, the silence. It's as if time itself has stopped, and nothing is real anymore. The figure is standing in front of me now, tall and dark, blocking the aisle. I try to move, to get away, but my body won't obey. My feet are frozen, my limbs heavy. My mind is slipping, the terror creeping in, blotting out everything else. You can't leave, the voice echoes again. I try to scream, but no sound comes. I try to run, but my legs refuse to move. The figure is right in front of me now, so close I can feel its cold presence. I can see nothing but darkness in its shape, and yet, I know it's there, watching, waiting. You're mine now, it says, its voice cold, distant, yet somehow familiar. I try to force myself to move. I try to push past the darkness, past the figure, but I can't. The bus is my prison. The walls close in, the air thickens, and I feel the weight of its words pressing on me like a physical force. You can't leave. The world outside the bus is gone, swallowed by the fog. The figure reaches out, its hand cold and shadowed, and I know that there is no escape. There never was. The bus speeds through the thick fog, the world outside an endless blur of white, and the air inside feels heavier with every passing second. I try to breathe, but it's as though the very oxygen is being drained from the space. My heart pounds in my chest, and the pressure against my ribs feels unbearable. I don't know how much time has passed. It could be minutes. It could be hours. My eyes are fixed on the figure in the aisle, watching me, its presence growing more oppressive. It doesn't move. It doesn't speak anymore. It just stands there, an unyielding shadow. But the air is changing. I can feel it. The bus is no longer moving in a straight line. It's turning, looping in ways that don't make sense. Each time I glance out the window, all I see is the same endless fog, the same featureless whiteness. I'm no longer sure if we're even still on a road. It feels like we're floating, suspended in nothingness. I try to steady my breath, to regain control, but the panic is rising in me again, clawing at the edges of my mind. I have to get out. I have to escape this place. I turn back to the door, but it's no longer there. I freeze. The door is gone. There's no handle, no sign of an exit. Just the cold, metal walls closing in, trapping me. I stumble backward, my pulse quickening. My hands shake as I run them along the edges of the wall, searching for anything that might be an escape. But there's nothing. It's like the bus itself has become part of the nightmare. I can feel the presence of the figure still, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. You can't leave, the voice whispers again, softer now, more insistent. I scream, no sound comes out. My throat is dry, constricted with terror. Suddenly, the lights flicker, dimming and brightening in strange intervals. The bus jolts, as though something is pushing against it, pulling it in different directions. I stagger and grab onto one of the seats, desperately trying to keep my balance. The engine roars louder, more erratic. My mind races, spiraling into chaos. And then, I see it. A shadow in the corner, farther back, where the seats should end. It moves, slowly at first, as though emerging from the darkness itself. I stare, my mind struggling to make sense of it. The figure is no longer just a silhouette. It's changing, shifting. Its shape elongates, twisting unnaturally, like a reflection distorted in broken glass. It stretches toward me, its form sliding closer and closer with every second, and I can feel the cold, suffocating air it drags behind. I warned you, it says, its voice like gravel, like 1,000 whispers blended into one. You shouldn't have come here. The words echo in my mind, reverberating, crashing against the walls of my thoughts. I can't think clearly anymore. The world is closing in. I try to push away, to escape from the shape, but it's everywhere now, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. The seats feel like they're closing in, the walls are tightening, and I can no longer feel the floor beneath my feet. I'm suspended in nothingness. In darkness. You're mine now, the voice repeats, colder, more final. I open my mouth to scream again, but no sound comes. Instead, I feel myself sinking deeper, as though the bus itself is consuming me. The fog outside the window thickens, swirling like a living thing, pulling me in. It's no longer just a bus that is alive, it's everything. The walls, the seats, the air, all of it is suffocating me, trapping me in a place with no escape. The shape moves closer. I can feel it now, its cold presence wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. Its fingers, thin and long, brush my skin, and I shudder in revulsion. "You can't escape," it says one last time. And then, there is nothing. No buzz. No fog. No darkness. Just an empty, silent space. I am alone. Or am I? I try to breathe, but the air is thick, choking. My body aches, my chest tight, and I can't feel my legs beneath me. I want to scream, but I can't. I want to run, but there's nowhere to go. I don't know how I ended up here. I don't know how to leave. But I can hear something. A whisper, faint at first, growing louder. It's the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, and coming closer. Closer. You can't leave. The voice is familiar now, and it's closer than ever. Have you ever found something that seemed completely ordinary, only for it to slowly start twisting into something unrecognizable, something unsettling? That's how it started for me. An innocent purchase, just a book, no different from any other on the shelf. I didn't think much of it when I first spotted it. It was old, worn, with a leather cover that had been softened by time. The title was faded, barely legible. I picked it up because it seemed interesting, mysterious. I hadn't planned to buy it, but there was something about it that called to me. Something I couldn't explain. It wasn't a particularly expensive book. I was used to buying things impulsively, especially when it came to old books. There's a charm in them, a kind of hidden history that fascinates me. I imagined that maybe it held a long-forgotten story, one that had been waiting for someone like me to rediscover it. The shopkeeper didn't seem to know much about it either. He just gave me a strange look when I asked where it had come from. He shrugged, almost like he'd seen it there before, but couldn't remember when or how. It didn't bother me at the time. In fact, it intrigued me even more. The first time I opened the book, the words seemed fine. The language was old-fashioned, but that was part of its appeal. It felt like stepping into a different time, a different world. The story was about a traveler who found himself in an unfamiliar town, much like the feeling I had when I first picked up the book. The narrative was engaging, drawing me in, but there was something odd about the way the text flowed. It felt almost too real, too vivid, as if the events were unfolding not just in the book, but in my own mind. I didn't think much of it when the first strange thing happened. I'd finished a chapter and closed the book, only to find that the next time I opened it, the text had changed. The words weren't quite the same as they had been before. It wasn't anything major, just a few lines altered here and there. I shrugged it off, thinking perhaps I had missed something during my previous reading. Maybe it was just a mistake in the printing. But as I continued to read, the changes became more noticeable. At first, the shifts were subtle, small phrases rewritten or reordered in a way that made the story flow differently. I began to wonder if the book was some kind of puzzle, meant to challenge the reader to follow along and piece together its true meaning. But then I started to notice something else. The changes weren't just in the text. They were in the story itself. The characters, once static, began to change. They were doing things they hadn't done before, saying things that didn't fit their personalities. It felt like the book was watching me, responding to me. One night, as I read by the light of a dim lamp, I noticed that the words seemed to rearrange themselves before my eyes. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but they remained the same. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just fatigue or maybe a trick of the light. But as I reached for a glass of water, I saw something I couldn't explain. The pages of the book were flipping themselves, moving faster than I could follow, until they stopped on a new passage, one I hadn't seen before. The text was different. It wasn't part of the story I had been reading. It was a new paragraph, a new thought, my own thoughts. Why are you still reading this? The words were clear, too clear, etched on the page as if they were speaking directly to me. You should put it down now. You don't know what you're inviting. I froze. I didn't remember reading those words, and yet there they were, staring back at me in stark black ink. My heart raced as I looked around the room, but there was nothing there. Just me and the book. Just me, with the words on the page and a growing sense of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. I closed the book immediately, but the words stayed with me. The book had changed again. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The words were too specific, too personal. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so, I opened the book again. This time, the words were different from the first time, but they were even more unsettling. You're not alone anymore. I didn't understand. What did that mean? The room felt colder now, like a chill had crept into the very air. I tried to convince myself it was just the weather, that I was reading too much into it. But the words on the page seemed to be watching me, growing more insistent with every turn. And as I continued to read, the lines blurred between the book and the world around me. I had to know more. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine. I told myself it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe I had imagined the text changing, or maybe it was a trick of my mind. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The unease lingered, like a weight on my chest. I kept glancing at the book, which now sat unopened on the table, as though it were silently waiting for me to return to it. That evening, I found myself once again drawn to it. I tried to resist, but curiosity got the better of me. The book seemed to call to me, its strange presence growing more insistent with each passing moment. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened it. I almost expected the words to have changed again, but this time they hadn't. At least, not at first. The story was the same as it had been the previous night, following the journey of the traveler in the unfamiliar town. The characters were acting as they had before, though something still felt off. The words seemed to whisper in my mind, echoing, lingering in a way that shouldn't have been possible. But as I reached the next chapter, the changes began again. This time, they weren't just in the text. The characters started to speak to me, not in their voices, but in mine. You should be careful, one of them said, looking directly at me from the page. The words were not part of the story, but they felt like they belonged to me. You're getting too close to the truth. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with tension. I didn't know what was happening, but it was clear that the book was changing me, not just the story. The lines between reality and fiction were blurring, and I was starting to lose my grip on what was real. I couldn't stop thinking about those words. You're getting too close to the truth. What truth? What was the book trying to tell me? I waited a few minutes, breathing deeply, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe I was reading too much into the situation. But when I opened the book again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The page had changed again, but this time, the words weren't just written on the paper. They seemed to be etched into the very fabric of the book. The ink was darker now, as if it had been burned into the page. It's too late to turn back now. The sentence appeared, But it wasn't just on the page, it felt like it was inside my head, echoing in my thoughts, reverberating through my skull. I tried to close the book, to put it down, but my hands wouldn't move. It was as though the book had a hold on me, pulling me in deeper into its twisted, shifting reality. The text, once something I could understand and control, was now something else, something that controlled me. You are part of the story now. The words burned into my mind like a tattoo that couldn't be erased. I could feel myself slipping away, my sense of self fraying at the edges. The lines between what was happening in the book and what was happening to me were no longer clear. I wasn't sure if I was the one reading the book or if the book was reading me. Panic set in. I had to get away from it, but every time I tried to move, the words followed me, crawling into my thoughts, suffocating me. I couldn't escape. The book was everywhere. I slammed the book shut once again, but this time it felt different. The room seemed darker now, the air colder. I could hear something in the distance, a faint whisper that I couldn't place. I looked around the room, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing except the book and the creeping feeling of being watched. That's why I saw it. On the inside cover of the book, in tiny, almost unreadable script, was a new line of text. "You're not alone anymore." My breath caught in my throat. Those words. They were mine. I hadn't written them. I hadn't even read them before, yet there they were, written in my handwriting. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. Somehow, the book had taken something from me, my thoughts, my memories, my very identity, and twisted them into its own dark narrative. I was no longer just a reader. I had become part of the story. And there was no way out. I couldn't stay in the room with the book. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. The words on the cover seemed to stare back at me, mocking me in some twisted way. I wanted to destroy the book, throw it in the fire, rip it apart, but I couldn't. Something inside me knew that even if I did, it wouldn't stop. It was too late for that. It had already taken hold of me. I grabbed my coat and ran out of the apartment, desperate to escape. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin, but it did little to cool the fire in my mind. My thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and confusion. How could a book, just a book, do this to me? It didn't make sense. I wandered the streets aimlessly, trying to outrun the creeping dread that followed me wherever I went. The feeling of the book, its weight on my mind, never left. It was as though the very air around me had thickened, pressing in, suffocating me. Hours passed, and I found myself standing in front of a small cafe, the warm glow from the windows beckoning me inside. I didn't know why I walked in. I didn't even want to be around people, but I needed to feel something, anything, other than the constant terror gnawing at my insides. I sat at a corner table, staring at my hands, trying to ignore the gnawing sense that the book was still with me. "Are you okay?" a voice broke through the fog of my thoughts. I looked up to see a woman standing by the table, her concerned eyes fixed on me. I forced a smile, though it felt strange on my face. "Yeah, just tired." She didn't seem convinced, but nodded anyway. "Well, take care of yourself." As she turned to leave, I noticed the way her footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet cafe. The sound reverberated for just a split second too long. It made my skin crawl. I shook my head, dismissing it. But the unease was still there. In the back of my mind, I could feel the pull of the book. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I returned to my apartment later that night, half expecting to find the book waiting for me, its pages open, its words still shifting. But the room was empty, quiet. I felt a brief flicker of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined it all. I went to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, hoping to escape into sleep. But as I closed my eyes, the words came rushing back, those words I had read in the book, the ones that felt like they had been burned into my soul. You are part of the story now. I bolted upright in bed, sweat beading on my forehead. The room was too quiet, too still. I could hear it then. The faintest whisper, like a faraway murmur, drifting just on the edge of my hearing. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the room, close, too close. My breathing quickened, and I felt my heart start to race. I turned toward the window, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. Just the darkness outside, stretching endlessly. The whisper continued, growing louder now, until it wasn't a whisper at all. You can't run from this story. You've already become a part of it. I froze, the words flooding my mind as they had before. I could feel the weight of them, crushing me. It was impossible to ignore now. There was no escape. The book, the words, they were everywhere. I ran to the bookshelf, grabbing anything within reach and hurling it across the room. Nothing helped. Nothing changed. My vision blurred as panic flooded my senses. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, and I could no longer tell if it was the book's power or my own fear twisting the reality around me. Then, just as I thought I might lose my mind completely, I felt it. A shift in the air, a cold, suffocating presence. I looked down at my hands, and there it was, words scrawled across my palms, not in ink, but in something darker. You are here. I gasped, the shock of seeing my own thoughts written across my skin overwhelming me. The book had done this to me. It had taken my identity, my very sense of self, and transformed it into something else, something part of its dark, ever-changing narrative. I could hear the voice again, louder this time, as if it were right next to me. You're part of the story now, and there is no going back. I looked around the room, desperately searching for something, anything, that could make it stop. But the darkness was consuming me, and I knew in that moment that I was no longer just reading a story. I had become part of it. And whatever happened next, there was no escape. The darkness in the room felt alive. It seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat, growing heavier with every breath I took. I stared at the words on my palms, unable to look away. You are here. It was true in a way that made my stomach twist. I wasn't just a reader anymore. I was a character, trapped within a story that was written and rewritten at will. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the whispers that had once been a distant hum were now right beside me. It wasn't just the voice I had heard in the book anymore. It was my own voice, echoing back at me, distorted and twisted. There's nowhere left to run, it said, and the words felt like they were seeping into my skin, coating my bones, becoming part of me. I tried to shake it off, to scream, to do anything, but my throat tightened as if it was being squeezed by invisible hands. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, and I reached for the door, desperate to escape this room, this nightmare. But the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, slamming my shoulder into it, but it was as if the walls themselves had become one with the story, trapping me in a page that wouldn't turn. I slumped to the floor, feeling utterly powerless, my breath shallow and uneven. And then, as though the universe itself was mocking my fear, the book appeared in front of me. It was lying on the floor where I had thrown it earlier. Its cover was dark, almost alive, shimmering faintly in the dim light. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at it, the source of all this torment. My hands, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the book. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the same impulse that drives someone to touch a flame despite knowing it will burn them. Maybe I thought there was some way to end this if I could just understand what was happening. As soon as my fingers brushed the cover, the world around me distorted. The room warped, twisting and expanding as though the walls were breathing. I felt a sharp, tearing sensation in my chest, like something was pulling me apart from the inside. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, everything had changed. I was no longer in my apartment. I stood in a vast, empty space, the air thick with fog. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, like I was walking on clouds. But there was nothing peaceful about it. The silence here was deafening. It pressed against my ears, louder than any sound I had ever heard. The weight of it pushed me to my knees, and I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. And then, the words appeared. They weren't on the book anymore. They were everywhere, in the air, in the fog. They moved like liquid, swirling around me, like they were alive. You cannot escape. I tried to run, but no matter where I turned, the fog shifted, trapping me in place. The words followed me, circling, growing. They began to form shapes, figures in the mist. I could barely make them out, but I could feel them. They were coming closer, and the closer they got, the more I felt like I was losing myself. You're part of the story now, the words whispered, and I recognized the voice from the book. But it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a force that wrapped itself around my mind. I felt my legs weaken, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I looked down at my hands again, but now the words on them had changed. They were no longer simple phrases. They were full sentences, messages that echoed in my mind, their meaning so clear and horrifying that I could barely comprehend it. You are the story now. You will never leave. I could feel myself slipping. The lines between the story and my reality were blurring, and it was impossible to tell which was which. My body was here, but my mind was somewhere else. Somewhere that the story had already taken me. I had been warned. The book had warned me. But I hadn't listened. There is no way out, the voice continued, and this time I could see it. The figure in the fog, dark, twisted, something halfway between human and something else entirely. It was me, but it wasn't. It was the version of me that had been rewritten by the book, the version that existed in this place. A reflection of myself, but wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It took a step toward me, and I froze, unable to move. The words shifted around it, folding and twisting into shapes that I could not understand. You are here now, and you will stay. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But as the figure reached out, I felt a pull deep within me, a tug that drew me toward it. I couldn't resist. I couldn't escape. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure's eyes. Empty, hollow, staring straight through me. And then the world disappeared. For a moment, there was nothing. Just a void, a complete absence of sound or light. But then, I was back. Back in my apartment. Back with the book. And the words had changed again. You never left. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the story had no end. Not for me. Not for anyone who dared to open it. And I was no longer just reading it. I had become part of it. I couldn't bring myself to open the book again, not after everything that had happened. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I looked at it sitting there on the table, its cover dark and uninviting. The words, those words, kept swirling in my mind, growing louder. They weren't just in the book anymore, they had taken root in my thoughts, in my very being. You never left. The words felt like a truth I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried to shake them off. I had been marked. Trapped in some way I couldn't understand. The room around me was too still, too quiet, and I could feel the presence of the book, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I backed away from it, but the air in the room had changed. The space seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me. It was as if I wasn't alone anymore. Something was there, something watching, waiting for me to make my next mistake. The silence was unbearable. It felt like it was alive, breathing in the room with me. I could hear the faintest whispering, like a wind rustling through pages. But no wind blew. No breeze passed through the window. It was just there, a presence without form, a sound without source. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the book. The moment my fingers brushed its cover, the world around me flickered, like a television losing its signal. The walls warped, the room bending as if it were made of liquid. The words from the pages leapt into the air, swirling around me, whispering louder now. You are part of the story. I could feel it. The weight of the words, the pressure of their meaning, settling into my chest, pressing against my heart. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense. There was only the story. And I was part of it. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them again, I would be free. But the darkness was all-consuming. It swallowed everything. There was no room, no space, just the endless void. The whispers were deafening now, pressing into my skull, tearing at my thoughts. You cannot escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My own thoughts were being overwritten, rewritten by the story. The book had changed again, and I was no longer the reader. I was the character. I tried to scream, to fight against the pull of the story, but my voice was lost in the suffocating darkness. The figure was there again, its form twisting and changing in the fog, always just out of reach. You are here now. You will never leave. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, a being that existed within the very fabric of the story, pulling me deeper into its web. My body ached as if the words themselves were carved into my skin. I could feel every letter, every phrase, every twist of the plot weaving its way into my soul. The book had done this to me. It had taken me, changed me, and now I was part of it. The figure stepped closer, its eyes empty, its gaze piercing through me. I could feel the darkness wrapping around me, suffocating me, consuming me. There was no escape. There was only the story. And I was lost in it. You will never escape. I reached out, trying to touch the figure, but my hand passed through it like smoke. It wasn't real. It was part of the story, just like me. It was nothing more than an echo of the words, a manifestation of the plot that had taken over everything. I felt myself slipping. My thoughts were fading, replaced by the words on the pages, by the story that had consumed me. And then, as if the story had finally decided I was no longer of any use to it, the figure disappeared, and the darkness began to pull back. I was back in the room. My apartment. The book lay before me, open to the last page, the words now etched into the air, lingering like smoke. You are part of the story now. The words were no longer on the page. They were in my mind. They were me. I looked at the book, but it was empty now. Blank pages stared back at me. The story had ended. But I knew it wasn't over. I was the story now, and I would never escape. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.